Yamnaya or Horsemen. Closer to the Bronze Age collapse, roughly the so-called hunter-gatherer group from the steppes on both sides of the Ural, YDNA-R1b, but north of the Black and Caspian Sea, will form the Yamnaya and amongst others the Sintashta-Ural and Botai-Kazakhstan areas, all taking part indirectly or possibly also directly in the Steppe Pastoralists. Please remember they have the same genetics and all are descendants of the American prehistoric haplogroup R1. As said, possible all will take part together indirectly or directly in the Sea People attacks, and in the to the south and eventually to the east spreading Steppe Ancestry. The group to the west of the Steppe Pastoralists, which we call the hunters related to R1b, receive most of the through the North Atlantic still incoming and arriving Americans. Further, these through the North Atlantic still incoming and arriving Americans will form or reinforce the corded Ware and Beaker cultures, and closer to the Bronze Age collapse, probably roughly from 4750 years ago, would be exclusively composed by Y-DNA R1b. This is detected by the extensive ancient DNA research of geneticist David Rye. David Rye, 2021. The Beaker culture expanded across Europe primarily between 2750 and 2500 BCE. This period marks the initial widespread distribution of Beaker pottery and the associated cultural practices. The Beaker culture then peaked in its expansion and influence, before gradually declining and disappearing between 2200 and 1800 BCE. In other words, all the four groups of newcomers that came across the North Atlantic and possibly keep on arriving would support or be part of the Sea People that would infiltrate the areas of the Bronze Age cultures, where they would totally dominate. Philistines that later become part of the Palestines, also Gaza, or B, fulfill none or less elite functions, including being mercenaries, for the earlier and still relatively intact typical Bronze Age cultures, causing the extreme warming thousands of years before the younger Dryas. We hypothesize that the four groups subject of this video, or still earlier other to them related groups, already had arrived long before the planned population turnover events in Europe and Western Eurasia, or rather before the extreme warming thousands of years before the younger Dryas, roughly 16,000 years ago. We hypothesize that these early groups caused the climate warming from 16,000 until 14,700 years ago. In other words, these early groups are started to cause the climate warming, marking the end of the older Dryas Ice Age, starting with and from the most recent Heinrich event, HS1, that occurred approximately 16,000 years ago. The Bølling-Allerød interstadial is the consequent and following warmer period and presents sea level rise, and is generally considered to have begun around 14,700 years before present. This Bølling-Allerød interstadial lasted until approximately 12,900 years BP, when the younger Dryas, a cooler period, considered an ice age, sets in, because the extensive melting of the massive ice from the ice age had caused the AMOC to come to a standstill, which on its turn led to a new ice age, generally called the younger Dryas Ice Age. Destruction needed to cause a warming to stop the AMOC causing an ice age. This total destruction was executed by the mentioned early groups, and would involve the destruction of all forests, and the indirect destruction or extinction of all megafauna, all eventual domesticated or herded animals, and almost certainly all present male humans, probably including all women and girls, in other words all of the at that moment Eurasian native humans. The extinction of the megafauna already by itself would significantly disrupt and weaken all at that moment Eurasian native humans. Clovis-like groups, Cro-Magnons, and descendants or follow-up groups, and especially the male native humans. Newcomers arriving out of America 8000 BP. The activities of the arriving out of America newcomers that are the main subject of this video, at least before 8,000 years ago, would be rather limited to their own survival, mining, and metallurgy, as well as the ongoing planned destruction and total extinction mentioned above. Extensive and intensive metallurgy would represent the main part of their activities from onset. This mainly to produce and maintain the needed warfare, and the surplus of metals eventually would be transported back to the Americas, possibly in exchange for more food and ongoing or even more support. Gobekli Tepe and the surrounding network, as well as Malta and Cyprus. With American-style rock paintings already 10,000 years ago, could have been part of the continental-scale operation, and or one of the bases for these activities, as said also or mainly to cause and assist the total destruction and tabula rasa, and possibly to create the for destruction and later population turnover event strategical, difficult to reach and easy to defend bases, as well as initiate further domestication and breeding, of also from the Americas brought animals, including horses and plants. Malta had resources like limestone, which is useful in metallurgy. Cart ruts were connecting mines and ports and delivering to buildings. Cyprus had copper resources. Cornwall and/or the American connection had tin. Altogether necessary or useful in metallurgy. The whole operation disposed of ocean and seaworthy ships and fleets. The culture or cultures in the Americas and possible extensions like the Azores would later be called Atlantis. The Americas and its eventual extension best fulfill the description made by Plato, because Atlantis was described as west of Gibraltar and the size of Libya and part of Asia together. The supposed submerging could simply and only mean the collapse or loss of power, and besides of that, also the Americas would lose substantial areas of fertile and strategic land, this because of the rising or flood of the ocean levels by 120 meters roughly from the onset of the Holocene, submerging Atlantis, across the Americas, as we claim. Or wherever it would have been on the planet if it had deltas, coastal areas, ports and/or cities.